so looking forward to I am so looking forward to the discussion this morning. For those of you who are just joined us, good morning. My name is Debbie Douglas, and I'm the Executive Director of OCASI. It is a thrill to bring you this morning's session. I am joining you here from Toronto, the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. Toronto, or Takaranto, as the Mohawks have called it since millennium, is subject to the dish with one spoon, wampum belt covenant, which is an agreement. The covenant is an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and Ojibwe confederacies to care for the land around and the lakes in this region. I love the vision of the dish with one spoon, especially during this time of talk of austerity as we prepare for a federal budget that looks to cut back on providing the resources required by communities, particularly Indigenous communities. Yesterday, our federal auditor general talked about how the situation of the housing of First Peoples, Inuit, First Nations, and Métis have not shifted since 2015, in spite of the rhetoric that we continue to hear from our elected officials. For those of us who are non-Indigenous, we have a responsibility to use every platform where we have the privilege to speak to decision makers, to speak to policymakers, to amplify the political priorities of First Nations, of Inuit, and of Métis. And especially in this month of March, when we celebrate the accomplishments of women, when we highlight the ongoing challenges and misogyny that women across the spectrum, cis or trans, continue to face, that we must acknowledge and stand in solidarity with Indigenous women who continue to struggle and fight for the bodies of their sisters to be found and to be brought home in Manitoba and throughout the country. So today, as we speak about the rights and the futures of our trans sisters, let us keep in mind the experiences also of First Nations, Two-Spirited, and trans people. And now I am delighted to present to you my sister and our brilliant, brilliant moderator, the Executive Director of the Canadian Centre for Gender and Sexual Diversity, and Debbie's bio is in the chat. Debbie Owusu-Akyeeah. Debbie.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today. And Debbie, thank you so much for setting the stage for what will be what I think is going to be a very awesome, engaging, challenging conversation on something that we're all witnessing and feeling very deeply. And that is the rise of anti-trans hate in Canada right now, but also globally, and the implications it has not only for us as individuals, but for those of us who are doing this work, supporting newcomers and refugees, those who are supporting LGBTQ people across multiple sectors. Not to put people on the spot, but I've saw different names that I recognize coming from the gender-based violence sector, coming from education, coming from housing. Thank you all for being here today. It's going to be a really, really good one. To start off, I wanted to do a little bit of framing of our conversation to really answer the question, like, why are we here? I think we all know the answer, but I'm a big fan of just providing that context and that history to set the stage before I introduce our agenda and also introduce the brilliant panelists that we have today that are going to be guiding this conversation for you all. I do want to say that we have tried to kind of co-develop this as much as possible with the participants. And so we have some questions that people provided beforehand, but we strongly encourage you to ask any questions in the chat, and those will be answered in a very dedicated section of our conversation today. And so if folks are okay with me starting off, I'm going to do a little bit of unpacking for my heart, because I've been feeling this deeply. My staff team has been feeling this deeply, and my communities, plural intentionally, have been feeling this deeply as well. Right now, we're all facing a moment where there is an immediate threat to transgender and gender diverse people. And this is coming as there are more and more public debates on the rights of trans people to exist, because that is exactly what we are witnessing. Accompanying this is also a threat to other social movements that have been integral to the rights of marginalized people from a variety of positionalities. This includes the rights of people who are impacted by misogyny to access public institutions and to challenge the culture that is embedded in every institution that ensures our subjugation under a patriarchy. This is the rights of Black and Indigenous and other racialized people to access space without the threat of police violence. And it's the rights of migrants to access services, basic services in Canada, like housing, work, and healthcare. We're seeing all of this happening at a time as we continue to deal with the impacts of COVID-19 on our economy, our ability to access accurate information, and most importantly, our ability to build connections, which is the necessary ingredient to building strong collective communities. In the fall of 2023, we all bared witness to all of these reeling their head with the highly publicized, highly debated 1 Million March for Children demonstrations that occurred in communities across Canada in late September. The attacks against 2S LGBTQ communities is not new. This is not something that just dropped from the sky. We as LGBTQ people have fought back on this time and time again. But what makes this a little bit different is what we see has become a much more visible and equally difficult thing to challenge, that difficult coalescing between white supremacists, far-right Christian nationalists, with religious nationalists from across different faiths. This has resulted in a visible and multicultural backlash to trans rights under the banner of so-called parental rights. For many BIPOC LGBTQ people, we have had to deal with the emotional and very intimate reality that our own community members, our own elders, were standing side by side the same white supremacist people who have historically spoken so loudly about not wanting us in this country. The same people who say our faiths, our cultures, and our beliefs are diametrically opposed to Canadian values. Politics makes for strange bedfellows. And so I want to repeat again that pushback on 2S LGBTQ rights and our social movements is not new. This pushback, this backlash exists across all cultures, across all races, across borders, and in different contexts. However, how that pushback is deployed politically, economically, and socially has evolved with each phase of our ability to fight and assert our rights as LGBTQ people. So we're currently dealing with the newest iteration of that backlash. This backlash is happening during an internet age where we are all supposedly supposed to be well connected with the power of social media. But we're also simultaneously dealing with misinformation that is allowed to take place on privately owned social media platforms. This is during an internet age that purposely confuses this idea of being well connected online, but with what's supposed to be well connected in person, which is again that necessary ingredient to actually building strong social movements. It's a backlash, and it's a public debate on gender ideology that is global. It is well-resourced, it's well-connected, and it is very smart at adopting tactics from progressive movements to assert itself. Like, who knew the far right and the anti-gender movements we're seeing would be really good at solidarity building? We are seeing this as far-right governments are elected around the world. And for many of us, our home countries are becoming the stage for an interesting battle where Western-funded laws are being introduced and passed to repeal human rights, which is forcing LGBTQ activists in the global south to go to hiding. It is forcing queer and trans people from the global south to flee. We're also witnessing at the same time here in Canada, elected officials outwardly flirt with this rhetoric, be influenced by the far right, which continues to pose an immediate risk to the potential of policies that are explicitly anti-trans, anti-LGBTQ, anti-democratic. We're witnessing this and feeling that feeling of helplessness. And that feeling is well-designed and it's intentional. If you are feeling stuck, if you're feeling confused, if you're unsure on like what to do next and where to even begin, I'm telling you right now, that feeling is by design. Even at my own organization, the CCGSD, we've heard from primarily white, well-intentioned educators say the following: I don't know how to respond to students who say it is their religious right to discriminate against LGBTQ people because I don't want to come across as racist. There's an issue there. And when people and allies who, on our side, for quote unquote, who hold the most power, are choosing to back away from showing solidarity because of this moment that we're in, we need to investigate that. We need to unpack that. And we need to debate that in good faith. Because what is resulting in all of this is the pitting of communities against each other. And that only serves to reinforce harmful stereotypes. That racialized and newcomer communities are inherently bigoted, and that all LGBTQ plus people are supposedly all white. Queer, trans, Black, Indigenous, people of color who are young and our communities suffer the most when this happens. There is data that shows this and that backs this up. So for today's conversation, our panelists are going to be discussing combating anti-trans discourse in Canada with a specific look at the intersections of race, faith, refugees, and migrations. And I'll be very honest, I have been waiting for a conversation like this for so long. So special shout out to OCASI and their team for bringing us all together. I've wanted so much to see a conversation that brings together Black and racialized trans voices and expertise to the table, alongside affirming Muslim leadership. Voices that should have been centered in this current fight that we are seeing due to that unfortunate coalescing of the far right with religious nationalists from different faiths. And especially as QT BIPOC youth are feeling extreme vulnerability right now. I think in order for us to collectively find solutions to the question, how do we combat rising anti-trans hate in Canada? We need to be centering the leadership. We need to be centering the lived experiences of those of us most at risk of when things will go too far. And so I am so excited to be given the honor to moderate this conversation. To provide an overview of what we'll be looking at today, I'm going to start off by introducing our brilliant speakers. And each of our speakers will have a few minutes to present some opening statements, opening remarks. And then I get to pick their brain a little by asking a few questions. And then you will have the opportunity to have questions that you've had answered through our audience Q&A. And so please, if you have those questions ready, please enter them in the chat. And then we're going to conclude with some closing statements before I return it back to Debbie to help us say goodbye today. So if we're ready, I'm going to quickly introduce our panelists because you don't need to hear from me, although I'll be chiming in, because they are the ones that you're here to listen to. And so I want to start off by introducing Tatiana Ferguson. Tatiana is a leader in equity and inclusion and the co-founder of Black Queer Youth Collective. In her private practice, Tatiana coordinates and facilitates capacity building activities for organizational and systemic change. Her work is informed by an anti-oppression framework with critical consideration to how the intersections of race, gender, and class interplay to create barriers for marginalized communities. Since immigrating to Canada from the Bahamas, Tatiana has been honored for her contributions to queer and trans activism, and she's actively involved in several projects and initiatives promoting health and well-being of 2S LGBTQ+ individuals in Canada. As a subject matter expert on gender and diversity and inclusion, Tatiana has worked with multiple community organizations and all three levels of government in Canada to improve the quality of life for equity-seeking groups. Notably, some of her leadership work has been seen through the Toronto for All campaign to raise awareness about racism and transphobia. And she's been consulted on the Toronto Action Plan to confront anti-Black racism and the federal 2S LGBTQ+ Action Plan. Glad to have you joining us, Tatiana.
Thank you, Debbie.
So our next speaker is El-Farouk Khaki. El-Farouk is an African dervish father, a feminist, who's gay, who's a human rights and dignity advocate, a husband, an imam, an immigrant, a lawyer, a Muslim, a reverend, a son, so many awesome things. He's a refugee lawyer that focuses on sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and has been doing this work for a while now, since 1993. He's a public speaker, a writer, an author, a media commentator on various issues looking at Islam, LGBT rights, refugee, politics, and queer parenting. For those who don't know, he was a founder of Salam, queer Muslim community, and is also a co-founder and imam of el-Tawhid Juma Circle, the Unity Mosque, and is a co-owner of Glad Day Bookshop, which I think is an awesome business that folks should check out. And on top of all of this, he has received so many different awards, and I cannot wait to hear his insights on today's conversation. So El-Farouk, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Last but not least is Celeste Trianon, who is an East Asian trans woman and strong-voiced activist. She founded and currently runs a legal clinic to support trans people, among others, to obtain the legal change of their name and advance access to justice in Quebec and the Atlantic provinces. On the other side of her work, she leads numerous initiatives for the advancement of the rights of trans people, both in Canada and her province of residence, Quebec, having helped respond to the massive anti-trans demonstrations like the 1 Million March for Children. Celeste's practices are rooted in a very simple statement. Everyone on this planet deserves to be able to thrive in the context of being free of prejudice. This motivated her to coordinate several campaigns aimed at government officials at critical times, leading to legislative and public policy changes that enable trans people, including trans migrants, to better meet their needs. While her work is rooted in grassroots community needs and activism, its impact can be felt at all levels of the government, as well as local communities. Celeste, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.
Awesome. So to begin, I'd like for us to start with some opening statements from all of you. And maybe Tatiana, we'll start with you first. You got a couple of minutes to kind of just share your thoughts and what you're bringing into the space and conversation today.
Okay. Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here to talk about this very important discussion. No more hate, trans rights and futures. Illustrated in the back actually was a project I worked on titled Transcending Love. And I think that's really what I'm bringing to this discussion today. I want us to really center the humanity of trans people. I'm not talking about trans people from a theoretical perspective, but really talking about those lived experiences. I know a lot of folks on this call might be interested in some of the data and the research that's available. So I've kind of suggested that we share a resource sheet with some information for the public, given that some of my work has historically focused on research and public policy. But yeah, I think that I'm hoping that I can bring to kind of recenter this discussion around the human experience of trans beyond kind of the rhetorics that we're seeing that seeks to undermine the experiences of trans people, trans non-binary gender expansive people.
Thank you so much, Tatiana. I'll pass it then to El-Farouk to just share some opening thoughts before we begin our panel discussion.
I have many opening thoughts, and my challenge is always where do I start? Where do I focus? Um, I want to acknowledge that I am actually on the indigenous territories of Mi'kma'ki, also known as Nova Scotia at the present time. I want to also acknowledge that today is March the 20th. It is the first day of spring. It is Nowruz, the first day of the Persian and region New Year. And with it comes hope for sunnier, brighter days. And so I think it's appropriate that we're having this conversation because I always say that activists are optimists. We aspire, we hope, we build towards a better tomorrow. Otherwise, why would we do this work, which is so much labor, emotional, spiritual labor? So that we are here today on the Nowruz, which is the new day, that we build towards a new day. And what I try to bring with me is an intersectionality, both of my own lived experience as a gay man, as a person of color, as a refugee lawyer, and increasingly as a Muslim and a Muslim parent. Reflecting, Debbie, on your comments around the buy-in from some of our racialized and minority communities into narratives that have traditionally been the purview of white nationalists and supremacists. So I'm looking forward to this conversation and sharing my thoughts, but also learning from my panel members. I loved your opening, by the way, Debbie. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for giving me the space also to share some thoughts as well. And so again, cannot wait for us to unpack in this conversation. Celeste, I wanted to throw it to you to just share some opening thoughts before we begin.
All right, thank you very much. So I'm saying hi from Jojagi, colonially known as Montreal, Quebec. And here the context is definitely very different, I'd say, at least to some degree, than the rest of Canada. But at the same time, it's very similar as well. My experience stems a lot from working, especially within white predominant contexts, as one of the rare, if not only, trans women of color within said spaces, trying to make things better for everyone, all while constantly dealing with racism, with transphobia, and other forms of hate, and also responding to hate in so many different manners, and hate fomented also by so many different groups. Doing all that work, especially I'd say over the last 12 months, has put me in this position where knowing what's happening, I know that the train's about to crash, but at the same time, there's a way to get it back on track. And that's what I'm here for today. Thank you very much again for the invitation.
So thank you so much, Celeste. And I really, really like that analogy that the train is off track and we're here to bring it back on track. And I think that's what we're all collectively doing. Not only us here on the panel, but I think for all of our colleagues and our comrades in this movement who've joined this conversation. And so I hope you're ready to begin, because Celeste, I do want to start with you, because I think, especially with what we're witnessing now with the public debate and the public discourse around trans rights, how it's not rare to look at a news article, look on social media where trans existence is being politicized in a way that dehumanizes trans people's experiences that Tatiana brought up. And I want to look at that language, because the language piece is super, super important for us. And so I want to start with you, Celeste, and maybe Tatiana and El-Farouk, you might be able to chime in after Celeste has gone and answered their question. The first question is, how does the language used by anti-trans groups, especially keywords like gender ideology, which I also spoke about in my opening statement, how does this language further hate against 2S LGBTQ+ people? And what can we do to oppose that, especially within racially and culturally diverse communities where using these English terms or French terms, especially for many allophones, might require a specific type of unpacking?
So just for some background context, I was one of the people who ended up helping promote counter-protests to the 1 Million March all across the country, that have helped drive a lot of efforts to, respond to hate nationwide. But at the same time, a lot of people are ill-equipped to actually acknowledge how this hate even gets into people's minds, because it should be very concerning that migrant communities might be working with white supremacists on any topic, period. When we talk about language, you oftentimes hear keywords such as quote-unquote gender ideology, such as quote-unquote indoctrination, and all of these words, they all sort of go back to the same roots, which is to present trans people as a theoretical concept, one that is free for the general population to debate, and one that is optional, in quotes, as in presenting trans as something that can be erased or eradicated. That is why you have politicians, whether it be in the global south or closer to home here, talking about quote unquote eradicating gender ideology. Oftentimes, these people, they choose their language specifically in order to not appear as if they were sponsoring statements which would in a way be considered genocidal. It's similar to a lot of other things we're seeing right now. For example, what is happening in Palestine. All of these things are extremely important to acknowledge. It's the connections between different forms of dehumanization. When you talk about quote unquote gender ideology versus quote unquote trans people, when you talk about quote unquote prisoners versus quote unquote hostages, it's the same thing. So it's very important for us to discuss about these connections and also talk to relevant communities about how this ends up being used as a way for them to forget about trans people's and just everyone's inherent humanity. That is why you have politicians who are able to start invoking the law and, in a way, breaking the rule of law in order to further anti-trans and anti-choice LGBTQ plus hate, whether that be here with the notwithstanding clause, or whether that be with so many other approaches that have been used to anti-democratically, or even just like anti-human rights, kill trans people's human rights. That's exactly how it works. It's because it's been enabled by this language, which allows them to hide the fact that this rhetoric is very clearly rooted in dehumanization, which is recognized as one of the many stages of genocide. I'll let Tatiana continue, and if I have anything else to say, I'm gonna jump onto that.
Awesome. Thank you, Tatiana. If there's anything you want to add there, Celeste, thanks for that answer.
Yeah, thanks, Celeste, for providing that context. And I think this reminds me back of like when we were first having discussions about gender and sexual diversity. For those of you that are in Canada, you may be aware that we often ask folks, what do they identify as? Giving the individual agency and choice to self-describe themselves. We talk about the self-determination and the importance of that in terms of really protecting folks. A lot of my work has historically focused on gender-based violence. Although I explicitly address the issue of transphobia and trans exclusion, in addition to some of the work that I've done in terms of protecting women and addressing issues that affect women and women of color. But I think that context is very important, Celeste, in terms of who has the agency, who has the choice. Are we empowering these young individuals who are not being kind of brainwashed or lured into transitioning, but in fact are themselves identifying as a part of community that's more gender diverse, identifying in ways that affirms their very truest essence. Gender ideology seeks to, I think, undermine individuals, especially youths, agency and awareness of their own self-identity. And I think that's where the real problem is. Here in Canada, I think it was in 2019, Statistics Canada collected data on, Canada's gender diversity for the first time in history. And what we know is that, based on the findings, there's over 100,000 trans non-binary people in Canada. which speaks to a very large population. And that was the first study. Researchers would always tell you, when you do research, the first is often kind of a foundational estimate or baseline. And as more folks become more comfortable, we're definitely going to see that number rise. With that said, I think this gender ideology seeks to undermine how many folks are trans in Canada, who has voice, and why are folks deciding to identify as trans. And those are some of the more problematic notions I see with language, and how language can sometimes be misleading. From a more personal perspective, I myself, I'm a trans woman. I often don't lead with that because I do think sometimes folks undermine other aspects of my my being. When we talk about intersectionality, or even when we talk, especially in the working world, about qualifications and credentials. But as mentioned, I focus so much of my work on gender-based violence, and I do see transphobia as a form of gender-based violence. It's a form of oppression against individuals who are identifying as trans. We know historically that trans folks have experienced barriers to employment. Some folks have been unable to complete their education due to bullying in schools. And we also know that in terms of their long-term growth, it has resulted in like a large number of trans and LGBTQ people being homeless. These are the features and factors that are very detrimental to the health and well-being of trans people. It's interesting we're framing this discussion today because at the end of this month is Trans Day of Visibility. And there will be a lot of voices globally of trans people talking about what being trans means to them. And that's what I wanted to share in terms of language. Who has voice? Who has choice? I'm a trans person, I'm sharing, but I'm also a working professional. So I'm kind of trying to always find this delicate balance of how much of my personal life do I need to share versus how much of the work itself needs to be focused on. So thank you, Celeste, for framing that initial context.
So, El-Farouk, I'm very curious about your thoughts on this question specifically, especially as we look at how language like gender ideology kind of furthers anti-2S LGBTQ hate, but specifically from racially and culturally diverse communities. So very curious to see your insights from some of the work that you do.
So my husband always says that, when we're having conversations, he's like, I'm not one of your clients. Don't be a lawyer with me, because language is so important in everything. And in my own work and in my own experience, I want to, Celeste and Tatiana, thank you. The interconnections between genocides and dehumanization. And so in my experience, in a lot of cultures, LGBT people were often dumped together without nuance. And so gay men, lesbians, gender non-conforming people, and trans people also are dumped in as homosexual or some wider category. But that just leads to an erasure of identities. It doesn't capture the nuance and so on. Now we have more words, but a lot of those words are weaponized with this notion of gender ideology and the reaction, for example, in Toronto to the inclusive education curriculum and people talking about their values and respecting their religions and their cultures and so on and so forth. But there's no sense of reciprocity that others should be respected. So, I just want to sort of touch on a personal experience as a gay Muslim family with a kid. Public school system in Toronto is not a safe place, particularly before the unfolding genocide in Gaza. Not a safe place because many Muslims were marching in these protests along with these Christian nationalists and white supremacists. And that's the irony of it. Now, after October the 7th, all of a sudden, they're not marching together anymore. And so language is really important in the way people are dehumanized, how they are lessened, and therefore not as worthy or not as deserving. And that with my work as a spiritual activist, it's that whole dehumanization that also extends into the spirituality, that that queer and trans people are somehow devoid of spirit or devoid of any connection with the divine or with our creator, and therefore just not as worthy. And this is sort of an increasing rhetoric. But I really appreciate the linkages made between the language and the dehumanization, and how we can be dehumanized on many different levels, concurrently and simultaneously. And for those of us who sit on those intersections, we juggle a lot of this. We often find also that, where do we as sometimes find safe spaces? Where do we go if we go into our larger ethno-racial religious communities? They may not always be the safest places for us. And whereas we still have to deal with white supremacy and Christian centricism in other spaces and other places. So I'm very thankful for being able to even articulate this.
Thank you all so much. And just to reiterate what you mentioned, El-Farouk, the appreciation with you for Celeste, and kind of making that connection between language, dehumanization, the erasure, and specifically the violent erasure of those who are told are unworthy. And for Tatiana, for you contextualizing it from your lived experience. And El-Farouk, for you to especially bring forth the perspective of how the strange bedfellows are no longer aligning themselves as things shift and change. And what does that mean in the context of the parents and parenting and other language we're also seeing that ties in that dehumanization, including the term parental rights, which works to dehumanize people on multiple levels, including children, regardless if they are LGBTQ or not. And so this kind of goes to my next question, which was actually presented to us by one of our participants. And so I'm going to read the question as is. And Tatiana, I'd love for you to start with the unpacking of this one. I'll read the question as is, as well as some follow-up questions that can help kind of move our conversation going. And so the question we received was, how can parents cope when they know their child is transgender? I think for us, when we were first looking at this question, we're like, okay, there's a lot that we can work with this one. And so, Tatiana, my follow-up questions for this are the following. How do we respond specifically to newcomer families who say they do not hate, but don't support transgender rights? That dichotomy that we're seeing. It's like, oh, I'm not a bigot. I just don't support transgender rights. And specifically when that is coming, that language is being deployed by newcomer families that are primarily racialized and are probably families that are served by many of the folks who are on this call today. And then the second follow-up question to this is, what can we do to provide a much more welcoming space for our transgender sisters? And that can be in multiple spaces, whether it's for refugee newcomer agencies, whether it's for policymakers, et cetera. And so Tatiana, I'd love for you to start off by answering that question.
Yeah, I'm like, how do I deconstruct coping? Like, how do I deconstruct this element of coping? Because I understand for parents who are very concerned about their child's well-being, like why that may be such a big concern. Given some of the challenges I've already shared, we understand that transphobia has impacted the livelihood and the quality of life for a lot of folks, trans people especially. For trans women, the life expectancy is about 31 years old, and that's really due to a lot of social and systemic factors that present challenges for them to really have long life. With that said, though, I think rather than just focusing on those negative factors and features, I think parents, caregivers, allies, service providers, researchers, and everyone in between has an opportunity to kind of create interventions for community. So how can parents cope? I would say, essentially, there are a lot of trans people who are doing amazing things. I don't want to call out all of my friends because I'm sure I'm going to forget some folks, but there are a lot of folks in faculty. There are a lot of folks in medicine. There are a lot of folks in law. There are a lot of folks like myself doing more community service work. There are folks in government, policy. Trans people are so integral to the part, especially here in Canada, to creating the infrastructure, this environment of diversity, equity, and inclusion. And that's something that we pride ourselves on as Canadians. So I'm hoping that that can unite us in terms of seeing possibilities for trans people to thrive, so that parents and other like caregivers are not viewing their young child or the person that they're in care of as someone who is kind of just going to be facing all of these adversities in their life, but more so viewing them as young people who can flourish and who are actually contributing to the change that we like to see. There are other questions that I feel listed here. Sorry, I need to pull it up. My memory is a little short. So the element of, I guess, it's not necessarily hate, but it's kind of does not align. Like, they don't necessarily support trans rights. I think those things are actually in very similar ways. They're very similar. If you're unable to support your child, if you're unable to actually hear them out, what you're doing is you're imposing your thoughts and values on them. And that can very much look like hate. That can very much feel like discrimination. That can very much create hostile living environments for these young people. And I'm sure like the intention is not to create harm, but that's what ultimately happens when you misgender a trans person. Misgendering can take many forms, as you might have witnessed today. Like, we have our pronouns displayed. It's not just a fashion, it's actually how we are presenting ourselves. In the event that folks want to direct questions to us, they're going to address us accordingly using the pronouns that are displayed. And like, that's just one form. Going back to language, when we talk about the microaggressions, being manning up or being male enough, being feminine enough, being a woman, like, these are a lot of words that can sometimes be detrimental to the health because it actually challenges these young people's sense of self. This is definitely working with Black, queer, and trans youth. This is definitely something that we've observed in our communities. The BQIC, the Black Queer Youth Collective, serve primarily, I would say, Black LGBT youth in Toronto and the Greater Toronto area. But what I see from really looking at who's engaged in our work, a vast majority of our participants are trans, non-binary, gender expansive, gender non-conforming, etc. Part of that is due to the fact that I myself am a trans person, and there's that element of relatability. Our Domino project was evaluated, and it looked at some of those initiators and sustainers. And folks spoke specifically about seeing themselves in their service providers. So I think that's a very important feature when it comes to addressing, hate or bias. And also allowing them to be, in my work with trans people, I don't impose my identity or the way I exist in the world on them, but I facilitate a space for them to explore for themselves. And I make the connections along the way in terms of providing the support that's needed on a needs basis. The last question is more specifically about trans women, and this is what I love. As mentioned, behind me, it's on this side. Behind me is this project that I worked on with the Queer and Trans Research Lab. And in that project, I wanted to center the experiences of African, Caribbean, and Black trans women while dating in Canada. So looking beyond one's individual sense of self, but looking at relationships that, kind of affirms them and may fulfill them. And I wanted to also show Black trans women as beautiful, because whilst it was very nuanced, we know that misogyny and trans-misogynoir, anti-Black racism, these things are very intersectional. It seeks to undermine who has value and worth in being in this world. So I wanted to show Black trans women as beautiful. And I wanted to discuss something that has not really been discussed in research as often. We talk about the violence, but we've not talked much about the pursuit of love, the pursuit of happiness, the pursuit of joy. We've not talked about healthy relationships for Black trans women. Every year, I kind of have to sit and deal with this unpacking of how many Black trans women are murdered globally for Trans Day visibility. And it often makes me question, like, how supported these young people were. Because like I said, the average life expectancy is only 30. So these are not like seniors. They're not dying from natural causes. They're dying from transphobic rhetorics. They're dying from personal attacks. And sometimes it's unbearable and they're ultimately taking their own lives. So I think what we can do to better support spaces for trans women is creating spaces led by trans women. Having a more wholesome discussion about what trans women, or what was framed in the actual question, like our trans sisters, like allowing trans women and of course for trans men too, because I sometimes hear that there there's always this focus on trans womanhood and not so much on trans men. But allowing spaces for trans people to talk about the range of issues that are affecting them mentally, socially, physically, and to allow them to have access points to ensure that those needs are not just being identified, but they're also being responded to. So I think that how parents can cope is definitely, increasing your knowledge, understanding that there are many successful trans people. There are many opportunities for trans people to contribute to Canada and the Canadian society and civil engagement and civil rights. And there are also opportunities for folks just to explore and kind of change the narrative to ensure that we are meeting them where they are rather than where we want them to be.
I love that approach, and that approach to your question around moving away from this deficit idea of what transness is, which goes back to what Celeste mentioned, right? When the language is meant to dehumanize you or to dehumanize transgender folks, if you're a parent who wants to mean well, and that's your only idea, that makes it challenging to quote unquote cope. But it's these possibility models that you speak to, the possibility model imagery that we see even behind you, Tatiana, that I think really is something that's important for us who are leading this work as advocates, but I think service providers to think about and to draw those connections and linkages. Because how powerful would it be for parents to see, especially racialized parents, to see racialized trans people thriving, but without losing sight of the reality that hatred does exist in our communities and societies. So thank you. And not to put you on the spot, El-Farouk, as a parent, but I'm very, 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 very curious to know how you would respond to, or how you maybe have responded to newcomers kind of speaking about, I don't hate, but I don't support transgender rights, and how, especially from your lived experience, the advocacy you do, the challenges you may have had. I'm even seeing your reaction now. And so very, very curious to hear your thoughts on this and how you've responded directly.
So my wheels are turning and have been turning through all of this. So for those of you who know me in person and have known me for a while, or know my husband, we're pretty gender non-conforming. This is on us, maybe more conforming as we've gotten older. But there's this notion of gender being a binary, and it is so instilled and so pervasive. But there's always been nuance in many cultures, African, Asian, indigenous cultures, and even European cultures have had nuances and third genders and non-conforming folks and so on. And to be honest with you, for me and Troy, it's been a bit of a challenge because our kid is also non-conforming. He's a COVID baby, and he grew up whirling. So he grew up with images of dervishes of all genders wearing skirts. And so he doesn't see that as being, and so one of the issues that he's had to face is people telling him, why are you wearing that? Girl, that's for girls. To the point that he, it was really, really difficult for him. And we said to him, we said, you can be whatever you want, and you can wear whatever you want, because we also then had to deal with our own reaction, which is we're trying to protect him from people's reaction. You are a mixed race child with Black and brown same-sex parents. Like, we got enough to deal with without you wanting to go out wearing skirts, right? And we had to step back from that and say, no, what do you need? And what are our prejudices? Like, what are we trying to protect you from if we're part of the problem? And my sort of response to sort of the larger issues is sometimes there is no space for us in some communities, and we need to create our own spaces. And when we are in a position of power and in a position of strength, they will come to us. And we don't always need to go to them and knock on their door and say, make space for us. Let's start making our own spaces and claiming our own power. And so I think for a lot of parents who are, dealing with kids who are trans or who are non-conformist, they're also afraid of how their children are going to be treated, being aware of the prejudices within their communities. But they're also fearing a loss for themselves from community, whether that community is a social, ethno-racial, or a religious community. And so we need to be, as activists, as change makers, need to also say, you know what, sometimes we need to create our own spaces without having to always knock on the door to say, is there space? And if not, let me just sort of squeeze in here and elbow my way in. Maybe we don't always need to do that.
Yeah, and I think you're doing some amazing work making that true with the mosque that you're involved with, the Unity Mosque, right? And how powerful it is to know that we can create those affirming spaces, but then also the power in what we should be doing and letting folks know that these spaces exist.
No,
and I know. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, go ahead, finish and then I'll add.
No, I was just going to speak to, I know Debbie and a few other Black LGBTQ people were in Ottawa a few weeks ago for the Building Our Future Summit, or Black to Our Future Summit, that brought Black LGBTQ people together. Those spaces are extremely powerful, even for us with diversity amongst Black LGBTQ people, to discuss what does it mean to intentionally create space when we do have the power to do so, right? So these examples are super key, especially if you go back to my opening statements, where for so many of us, we're seeing the pitting of communities, and those of us at the intersection feel them intimately. We can create those spaces where we can bring all of ourselves. But I'll throw it back to you before I want to quickly conclude with Celeste's thoughts, and then we'll move to the last question.
So two things. One is, I had one of my Muslim aunties just a couple of months ago. We were at a gathering, and this is somebody that I have known since I was in my teens, so that's like 45 plus years, and who said to me, there's not a single family that doesn't have at least one queer or trans person in them anymore. Speaking within the Muslim community, there's not one single family. They just don't want to admit it. And when we create our own spaces too, though, it's important that we also recognize the diversity within our own communities. And so Troy missed out on this conference. He wasn't aware of it happening because we're sort of busy with our own little corner of the world. But when we arrived in Nova Scotia, he attended a local gathering of artists and creators and so on and so forth. And this is the month of Ramadan, and many Muslims are abstaining from food and water during the day. So they had this gathering. There was about 30 people there. And when they sat down for lunch, they said a blessing, which ended in Jesus's name. And so, Troy didn't say anything about it, but, I said to him, I said, well, I think you need to say something about it, because there is an assumption here that, first of all, everybody believes in a creator, and not everybody does. So there are atheists, and then there are polytheists, and then there are people who are not Muslim, who are not Christian. And it's not enough to say, well, folks around here are really churchy. They need to recognize that some Black folks are not Christian, and that blessing didn't quite embrace them. So here is a Black empowerment, a gathering to empower Black creators, artists, and musicians, and writers, and so on. But they are still seeing their Blackness as a monolith. And so as we chip away at this notion of any society or any culture, including a dominant society, culture or racial group being monolithic, we also need to chip away within our own community spaces as well to that notion. So
thank you so much, El-Farouk. Celeste, really quickly, were there any thoughts that you had on the question on how to respond to parents and newcomer families who speak to, not hating, but also not supporting trans rights? Just curious if you had any additional thoughts to add.
Absolutely. So on this, I'm gonna speak more about parents themselves so for context, I'm a trans young person. I'm currently 20 years old. I started transit. I came out and started medically transitioning as a minor. So I know what that was like. And I'd say probably the one piece of advice I have for parents, and that's, of course, assuming that parents, they know that they have their kids' best interests at heart. They want that. probably the most important thing is to not isolate yourself, to not silo yourself, to actually actively seek out community, or, as I've already said before, build one if it does not exist. You don't have to be alone as a parent going through supporting, the trans young person through their gender journey, because that's not something that's really realistic. To be surrounded by people who have similar experiences as parents, as people who know about like what it's like to parent a trans young person, that can help so much. And to not be alone, that is probably one of the most healing things any parent can really have in their life. So if there's one thing I can really say, it's that.
Thank you so, so much. Tatiana, was there something you wanted to
Yeah,
add?
I was just gonna say before we move on, I would say since this is live broadcasting, PFLAG, Parents and PFLAG, it's a Canadian organization for parents who have LGBTQ children. We are inviting, especially those of us from racialized communities, we are inviting you to make those connections. I think when we look at those great unifiers, parents can speak to parents in ways that they may not be open to having a discussion with a child. Children should know their place. I'm a Black girl, so I know what it is to be under Black parents. But I'm encouraging, Black parents who have trans children. We know that there are always discussions happening. Contact organizations that are already doing this work. And hopefully, if you have the time and if you are really, really invested in your child's well-being, connect with other parents. And then we can kind of create these linkages. I also recall speaking specifically about a program for trans people. I recently met someone from FIT, Families in Transition. Get fit, families. Families in Transition at Central Toronto Youth Services. If you are in Toronto, please reach out to them. We want to see more racially diverse households engaging in these groups that are kind of helping to sustain family supports. We don't need child welfare to get involved. The BQYC and myself have already been involved in consultations around that. We're looking to unite families, but it's going to require a more open and honest conversation. Talk with parents who are like-minded, and of course, also be open to learning. Because as Celeste mentioned, it is a gender journey. Everyone's at different phases. There's no official start date. There's no end date. Some folks come out in their adolescence. Some folks come out later in life. But what's important is that you find communities of like-minded folks, and we create communities that allow folks to flourish.
Thank you so, so much. And I was going to say for our audience today, we will be sharing some resources that have been curated, some from my organization, some from the folks who are sitting in the panel today. So if you're looking for resources to share with parents who have questions, we got you. So thank you so much. Before we do move to the Q&A portion of the conversation, and I've been looking at some of the questions that are coming in that are incredible. El-Farouk, I want to put you on the spot just one more time, if you let me. And this is another question that came directly from our participants, and it was a question actually specifically directed to you. And so the question was, what can we Muslims do to eliminate or at least reduce transphobia within our own communities? And the follow-up, which I think is a really important one, and it will invite maybe Tatiana and Celeste to share their opinions too. How can host communities better support the needs of transgender individuals within refugee and migrant populations? So El-Farouk, I'll give it to you first to start.
Very easy questions, huh? So within the Muslim context, I think it's important to understand no community is monolithic. Just so my reference in my last comment about the Black community not being monolithic. No community is monolithic. That includes white folks. That includes Muslim folks. There is no singular Islam. There has never been a singular Islam. There has been no singular practice. There are dominant narratives within the Muslim tradition. I think that with the growing social conservatism, there is a notion In Islam, and I can to some degree speak about Christianity because it's all around me, and it's the faith community that has been dominant in my upbringing in terms of where we've lived. There's a notion that, but in Islam, there's this notion that everything is on a binary. And maybe that has something to do with the Arabic language, because in the Arabic language, everything has a gender. Everything is either masculine or feminine. But if you go to a language like Baha Malay, there is no gender. So how does that affect our understanding of the world around us? But this notion that a gender binary is the foundation of the world, and therefore also of theology, I think is problematic. And I think it's also inaccurate. And so one of the ways of sort of creating a conversation is around the historical examples that we have. So we have examples within the time of the Prophet Muhammad, and in fact within his own household, of gender non-conforming people who in Arabic are referred to as mukhanat. And maybe that's an umbrella term. It refers to diversity of folks, including men who might have been castrated, but it also refers to intersex people. It also refers to trans people or LGBT people, depending on where and when and who. But there are all these historical examples. And if you look at Muslim cultures, I read a book, I haven't read it, I lie, but it's on my shelf along with a lot of other books, called Allah Made Us Funny. And it's about effeminate men in the city of Kano in Nigeria. And this is a historic community. And it's being erased again with Arabization and the growth of fundamentalism. But in Indonesia and in Southeast Asia, you have the Waria. In South Asia, you have the Hijra or the Khwaja Sarai communities, which are trans or non-conforming communities. So we have a huge historical banquet table, if you will, of gender diversity. And the religious, the ulema, the teachers, and so on, accommodated that. There are actually rulings, fatwas, historical conversations around even where, for example, where kunta or third gender folks, where they would pray, because Muslim prayer has become genderized. And so men and women pray separately. So where do people who don't fit into those categories, where would they pray? These are conversations that historically the religiously educated folks actually did have. But that understanding, those narratives have all been wiped away. They're just not part, because they're inconvenient truths. Right. So let's erase them. And then let's just deal with what our societies look like with the imposition of colonialism and Victorian values and Victorian laws that actually said that we were something less than. It doesn't mean that we had full equality in many of our spaces or places, but there was actually conversation and there was actually space. And so therefore possibility that we were part of the society, that we were recognized, that we were there, as opposed to something to be eliminated. And that's how I would come to from a historical perspective. I also think that it's important for us to advance the notion of reciprocity. You cannot ask for your dignity while denying somebody else theirs. And so if you want dignity as a Muslim, well, I'm a Muslim, so I should have my dignity. But then you want to take away my dignity as a gay person, for example. So dignity and rights, human dignity is indivisible. And we need to create not a society of tolerance, but a society of acceptance that another person's dignity is just as fundamental as your own, regardless of how you define who you are, and to allow other people to do that. I don't know whether that addresses your question.
It does. I think it's an important reminder for many of us across faiths, like you spoke about it, across faiths, cultures, religions, even European, that we have always been here, which pushes back on some of the harmful myths that this language continues to showcase, that you cannot be two or have two or multiple. I cannot have my Blackness, my Ghanaianness, and my queerness at the same time. But if we look at the things that have been taken away from us through colonial processes, we have always been here. And I think that notion is really important. And I am keeping an eye on the time. I don't know if there was anything that you wanted to follow up with, but
I think it was Tatiana who mentioned our wholeness, right? Like we are all of those things all at the same time, and we're not a theory. We're not a theoretical, because a lot of times when they talk about us, however we define us at this point in time, it's always a theoretical conversation. It's never a lived experience. And religion is like that. People talk about the theory of religion, but really religion is what we breathe. If we have sacred text supposedly breathes into us, but we breathe back into that sacred text. So we give it life. And so our lived experience is actually central to any conversation.
Oh, that's beautiful. I love that. We bring this, we breathe life into that. Ooh, Tatiana?
No, I was just going to say, I think building on some of the sentiments that was shared, in all faiths, there's kind of this invitation to have a discussion, because there has been what seemingly is a disassociation between one's core identity and their spiritual one. And we're seeing, especially, I was just on a panel, I think hosted by Gal, that looks at intersectionality, faith, and indigeneity. I encourage folks, if you have access, to access that resource, because it spoke specifically about faith and how faith shows up with queer people for those that are of faith. So kind of opening the invitation to all different types of faith and spirituality to have a discussion with their community members, because we cannot disconnect community in terms of their gender identity, sexual orientation, race, class, and all of these other features from their creed and their spiritual belief, because we are whole beings. There's a saying, we are spiritual beings in human form, and I really believe that's the case. So I just wanted to kind of extend that invitation. And of course, there are groups too. There are, non-denominational groups that allow folks of multiple faiths and non-faith to come together to discuss, just being and their very existential existence.
Awesome, thank you. And thank you so much, all three of you, for letting me throw these three questions at you and get you to chime in on each of the responses. I think there have been some really amazing themes that have come out that I think we're going to be able to carry into the Q&A section, which I promise those attending, I've tried my best to make sure there's enough time to answer, if not all, at least maybe some that are resonating the most to our panelists, and at least to the expertise of the folks who are attending today. And so I'd like to move on to the Q&A section. And if you haven't added a question yet, please do. If they are not answered today, I'm sure, and I'm looking at our OCASI folks, maybe there might be another mechanism or avenue to unpack some of these questions. But to start off, I'm just looking at the list that's been given, and my co-panelists, I don't know if you can see the Q&A section. Is there one that stands out to you that you folks would like to start off with? Otherwise, I'll gladly pull one of these to throw at you folks.
I tried to answer. I did take a glance at the questions, and I tried to answer particularly Gitanjali's question. But there's one by I believe Carol Abu Musa. And it's about indoctrination and grooming and so on and so forth. And again, I just want to touch on that. And I think this notion of indoctrination and grooming is based on this notion that there is a binary and that anything that deviates from that is abnormal and is taught, as opposed to something innate and fundamental to the individual. And so when you shift away from this notion that the world is black or white and that there are no grays, and that the same thing is true for gender or sexuality, I think that is an important narrative to bring forward, because we're not trying to convert anybody. In fact, we've had conversions forced on us, rather than trying to convert people into our way. Most queer and trans folks I know at some point in their lives wish that they weren't, until they learn to love themselves. And learning to love yourself in a world and in societies which tell you that you are not worthy, that you're not human enough, is the challenge. So I would say that we need to dispel this notion of grooming and indoctrination. In fact, it's quite the opposite. We are the ones who are subject to that kind of violence and abuse all the time.
So thank you. Real quick before I jump to the next question, because I'd like to go through the ones that I think folks would resonate. Tatiana, Celeste, anything to answer the question that was presented by Carol? And that specifically looks at this idea that there's an overemphasis and indoctrination of children in schools and other contexts on trans issues in queer communities. Go ahead, Celeste.
Yeah, I'm gonna add just something very quickly on that. I know it's reasonable to believe in a way we talk about gender identity in schools in a way that very much still fits within the colonial paradigm of education as a whole. So it's normal to not understand at first, but at the same time, it's important to remember that this is all about teaching people about what society looks like. It's teaching what reality looks like. Refusing to teach about gender identity in schools would be akin to refusing to teach about evolution, which of course, it's science, but at the same time, it does not exclude the possibility of, having a faith-based education, whether at home, within a religious community, or beyond. So it's important to say that it's not mutually exclusive, that it is possible to teach people about gender identity without, say, breaking people's charter rights. It is very much something that can coexist. It's important not to forget that. At the same time, though, it probably would be very important for us to start advocating for talking about queerness and transness in a way that does not, talking about queerness and transness in a way that refutes the very white queer dominant narrative that we still hear all the time within our schools. And if I believe there's a form of indoctrination we need to confront in schools, it is white supremacy.
Period. Thank you, Celeste. Celeste, I'm looking at the Q&A box here that there was a question that you wanted to answer, and I'm wondering, Tatiana, if you might be able to add on to this. Asia says, I'm curious if you folks, can share about the connections of TERF movements, and that is trans exclusionary radical feminist movements to white supremacy, and how it resonates globally. When will we as trans femmes stop being perceived as a threat in sports and washrooms? And I think I'd really enjoy the global reference because we are seeing in different international spaces like the UN, like CSW, we're seeing TERF rhetoric find its way in there. And these are the spaces where collective action on human rights globally gets discussed, where women's rights gets discussed globally, that has, again, impact on all of us when we're thinking about those connections that we have transnationally. So basically, the influence of TERF movements have a direct impact on the laws of many of our home countries, which results in what we're seeing now with anti-LGBTQ bills. We're seeing a pushback on abortion access, and that, of course, trickles here in North America as well. And so, Celeste, maybe we'll start with you and Tatiana if there's anything that you wanted to add.
Absolutely. So on this, there's a lot of I'd say there's a lot of analogies between trans exclusionary feminism and the current like movements within like diverse cultural and religious communities against trans rights. It all stems from the same roots and stems from a fear of having like one's own rights being taken away. But say in particular when it comes to turf movements, the best analogy I have is how to say Israel depicts Palestinians. Because in a way, the turf movement is, of course, it's rooted in women advocating for their rights. And that's 100% something we need to further. And women have been historically and also presently marginalized. But at the same time, by presenting trans people, and in particular trans women, as threats against womanhood, it basically positions the oppressed as the oppressor, now seeking to oppress an even more marginalized group, at least currently. It's akin to how the state of Israel is depicting Palestinians as a threat to Jewish people worldwide. And 100% anti-Semitism exists. We need to acknowledge it more. We need to combat it in every single shape and form. But anti-Semitism but Palestinians existing is not a cause for anti-Semitism. We need to a lot of these connections here are very important to make because they're connections between otherwise complete unrelated topics. And it's important for us to name them. It's important for us to openly discuss how these movements use the language of the oppressed in order to turn them into oppressors. And it's important for us to name this in order to tell people that it is unacceptable. Now, of course, once that is finished, we'll no longer be perceived as threats anywhere. And we'll be able to start having rational discussions about, say, for example, fairness in sports. That can be like all these topics. Right now, they're excessively politicized because of this, because of fear. And it's impossible to have a rational conversation without, like, in a context where fear exists. So first and foremost, we're going to have to work on dismantling the very structure that holds anti-trans feminism together.
Oh, go ahead. I'm trying to frame this in the right context because, in my opinion, I think it's impossible to be a feminist and to be exclusionary because feminism, by definition, is a person who believes in the equality of all sexes. And we understand that there is gender and sex diversity. So I think that there's this element of conservatism that's linked to whiteness and that's linked to colonization and colonial ways of being. I think it's very problematic, especially as a Black person who kind of echoing the question that was asked of El-Farouk around transphobia in Muslim communities. I see a similar discussion around transphobia coming from Black communities. And I think it's very problematic and misleading to say that, all individuals from a group have the same way of thinking. And this is why I was saying it's an invitation to kind of challenge those notions. I don't think all feminists are TERFs. I do think there are a subset or a group of individuals within feminist movements that do seek to empower themselves or catapult themselves above others, which in itself is creating inequity. It's creating inequality in a movement that's designed for equality. So there's like a contradiction there. Similarly, I know it's controversial, but the reality is I have friends, colleagues from all different racial groups, especially here in Canada. And I don't think whiteness in itself is to blame for some of the rhetoric that's being used. As a Black person, standing in solidarity and allyship, we talk about indigeneity and standing in solidarity with Indigenous communities. We understand the root causes, but we're also strategizing in how do we respond to some of the challenges that different communities are experiencing. With that in mind, I do think that there are relationships, kind of they're recruiting folks who are like-minded. They're allowing folks to be misled to kind of co-sign or co-opt into things that may not fully align with their values. And that's where I'm inviting those of us that are willing to join the discussions to kind of combat that. We are saying no in the Black community. Our communities are not homophobic, biphobic, transphobic. Whiteness is not, transness is not a white thing. I am a Black trans woman. Those are Black trans women illustrated. We're saying no to these notions that our very essence is trying to emulate whiteness. No, we are existing in our truest form. And because historically through mainstream media, we've only been able to see gender diversity through a white lens, that's kind of also one of the bigger issues we're dealing with systemically, where white supremacy is now being blamed, but also white supremacy, or I should say whiteness, white people have historically been the most visible, despite those of us that are aware of LGBTQ histories, knowing that it was people of color who actually led those movements. But yeah, I think that I'm willing to have a conversation with these quote unquote TERFs, because I need to understand how they position their approach and their understanding of feminism to inform, some of the decisions they're making.
So thank you so much. Again, keeping a look at time, but I know that there's some questions that we have in the Q&A that have not been answered. And again, for the OCASI team, I hope you're noting these questions down. There was a comment in the chat that there's going to be a roundtable tomorrow. Please click the link if you're available in 3, because this conversation does not begin or end here. To move us along, though, I was hoping our panelists would be able to take 1 minute each to go around and just share their concluding thoughts. Before I let you do that, I just wanted to reiterate again, thank you, all 3 of you, for taking the time to let me throw questions at you and pick your brain. I think there's some beautiful themes that have come from this conversation that looks at language, its association with dehumanization, the importance of showcasing possibility models and moving away from a deficit understanding when it comes to transness, and how important that is for parents who are coming from newcomer, refugee, or other faith communities. But then also the beauty and understanding that the history of our faiths and our cultures have always showed that we have always been here. And connecting these dots are super key as we're going to continue to combat anti-trans hate in Canada and the direct impact it has on Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities. So Celeste, we'll start with you to give about 1 minute concluding thoughts, maybe what you'd like the attendees of this panel discussion to take away with them.
Absolutely. So there's one thing I want to say, and I want you all to take away today. It's that, of course, this is not something that's gonna, making sure that trans, refugee, immigrant, culturally diverse, racially diverse communities, make sure that they feel included and making sure we have spaces for them. It's not something that's going to happen at the end of the day. It's not something going to happen tomorrow. But if there's one thing that we can all strive collectively to work for, it's to build safer spaces and to create ways for these people to form their own communities. It's important to listen to people. It's important to be mindful of their needs and let them take the lead. But at the same time, it's important that we help give them the tools necessary in order to create said spaces. So there's one thing that we all can do. It's to make sure we are equipping the people who need it the most in order to build a better, more inclusive Canada for all of us.
Thank you so much, Celeste. El-Farouk, any concluding thoughts and takeaways you want our attendees to bring back to their communities there?
Yeah, one thing that I sort of had made notes on and that I didn't touch on is this notion about parents and children, and within the Islamic narrative, there's a notion in many of our cultures, children are our hopes, our futures, their happiness is defined by us, or by the parents. And yet in the Islamic framework, children are not the property of the parents. They are the property of God, of the divine. and they are entrusted to parents as a trust, as an amana, or as a trust. And so how do we fulfill that trust as parents to rear children who are the best of who they are meant to be? And I invite folks to shift their thinking about their relationship with their children as rather from possession to stewardship. And that might also then help with this notion of how parents respond when their kid comes out as queer or as trans, and what that child needs to be whole and to be loved and to be fulfilled.
Thank you so much. And last but not least, before we then pass it to Debbie to close us off, Tatiana, your concluding thoughts today. You're on mute, Tatiana.
So I was just gonna say, I'm just gonna briefly share my screen because I feel like there's what I call a resurgence. Oops, wrong screen. This one. At least it's the same image, but I just wanted it to be centered. With this in mind, the message on this campaign, it was a campaign funded by the city of Toronto in 2017, Toronto for All. At the bottom, it reads, trans youth of color are part of Toronto, transphobia is not. So I'm hoping that in closing this discussion, we recenter this discussion about the humanity of trans people. Gender is internal. Gender is who we are. It's how we show up in the world. It's not our anatomy. It's not any type of physical attributes. We understand through some of the discussions we talked about in terms of gender journeys that there are different start points and different end goals for trans people in their journey. And with that said, I just want to kind of reiterate this message that our goal is to promote inclusion, and transphobia is just not a part of that. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you, OCASI, once again, for the honor of moderating such an amazing discussion. With that said, I'll pass it to you, Debbie Douglas, to close this off.
Thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you to our fantastic panel for such an enriching and empowering conversation. We continue at OCASI the conversation tomorrow. Mata has posted in the chat a link to a roundtable that's being hosted by our Positive Space Initiative colleagues at the council. Please continue the conversation there tomorrow. Please go in and register. Thank you to our fabulous host, Debbie, Tatiana, El-Farouk, and Celeste, our panelists. Thank you so much to all of you for staying. We are also always so appreciative of our interpreters, both our English and French interpreters, as well as our ASL interpreters. You make access to OCASI's offerings so much more deeper. We truly appreciate you. We will be launching a survey as soon as you begin to hang up. So please complete the survey that will be launched in your browser when you exit the Zoom. Your input is very important to us, so please take a minute or two to complete it. The session recording will be posted on YouTube, and you will receive a follow-up email with links to the recording and resources that Debbie talked about that we will be providing for you for further learning and engagement. Thank you to everyone. Again, register for tomorrow's roundtable. Have a wonderful, wonderful rest of day. Happy Wednesday. And thank you to the OCASI team for putting on such a wonderful event. Congratulations, sector and colleagues, for showing up and staying. We had a full house this morning. Thank you. Debbie, you're a fabulous moderator. Truly appreciate it.
Thank you.